Okay, good morning everybody. God, it is early. Definitely not a morning person. I'm glad that you're here. Let's get started. Today I'm going to talk to you. I want to bring up the issues of puzzles, explanations, and mistakes of fallacies. Okay, before we start, I was asking for the course about some technical issue about the readings. You know, sometimes there are some mathematical issues in there. As I said the last time, this course is about thinking, right? So it's about understanding what is the broader message here. So for the exam, you won't be required to know the mathematical details that are elaborated in a text. So don't freak out when there's a formula. For the next text, there are some mathematical formulas and equations in there as well. Don't freak out about that. Read through it, read over it. All of these texts explain it very clearly in words as well. That's what I want from you. Okay, so let's get started. Let's get started with a quiz. We start with a quiz. It's a fun thing to do. First, I have a question which has actually nothing to do with the readings. It's just something where I will come back to in this course or in this lecture later on. So take out your phones, whatever you have, your computer, all the devices, and answer the first question. Okay, well, we see we have a clear winner here. Although I'm just going to leave that open. That's a cliffhanger. I come back to that later on during this lecture and you'll get the answer and you'll be surprised. Okay, but now another question that has to do with the readings. So remember when we had this one text by Bickel and others. It was about graduate admissions at Berkeley. And the question is, was there discrimination? Okay, well, the great thing is that I see here is that none of you said the first thing. And that's great. That tells me that you got the paper. Because in the paper it starts off with the observation that males seem to be favored. Actually, you know, that when you look at the percentage-wise, it's sort of, if you look at the total population of those graduates applying to Berkeley in 1973, male applicants had a success rate of 45%. While female applicants had a success rate of something like 35%, right? So based on that, you would conclude that there was discrimination in favor of males, right? But then the whole point of the paper is that was actually not the case, right? And the reason being, we'll come back to it later on, the reason being is that male and females apply to different departments, and different departments have different acceptance rates. Right? Male, 1973, these were the good old times. You know, there was the acceptance rates in mechanical engineering was much higher than in the English department. male applied more often to the mechanical engineering department, female applied more often to the English department. Then based on that, we came to that macro level outcome where it seemed that males are being favored, while in fact it was not the case. Anyway, but I come back to that. What I want to do with you today, I want to talk about three things. As I said, puzzles is kind of the stuff that we want to explain, and then explanations. There I get into the structure of explaining things. And thirdly, I'm going into what we can call fallacies, or the problems that we can have when making these explanations, where this little example of the Berkeley study was one prime thing. Right? So that was sort of one way to show you how sometimes we need to be very careful about what we're explaining and at what kind of level we are looking at. Okay, so remember, in analytical sociology, we're trying to do the big stuff. We are trying to do the really important things, which is explaining things. So we want to not just describe the phenomena around us, we want to get a good understanding of, we don't just want to look at why things change, but we want to understand how exactly does that work, how are the things related with each other. So it all starts with the thing that we want to explain. Right? So it starts with the question. And there are different ways to have a question. I always urge students to think very clearly and a lot about that question, because without a question, you're not going to have a good solution either. So you might find something, you might have an idea about the world, but if you don't know what the problem is, you're standing there by yourself. So start with your question, don't do it the other way around. And then go and then try to find the theories, try to find the methods, try to find the data, whatever you're going to do, whatever strategy you're devising to answer your question. So that sounds trivial, but that's sort of very important, right? And often people, even serious academics, make the mistakes of doing it the other way around. So how can we go about finding questions? Well, there are different strategies here. You can have the same questions that others already had. You can have a replication study, or you can have a theoretically oriented question where you see something in the theory and you wonder how does that apply or what does it mean. Another very interesting way to get about questions is looking at puzzles. And that's sort of what we call a puzzle. A puzzle is not just a general topic, such as the effects of gender on wage, but it's something else. It's a correlation or an observation which sort of defies our expectations of our common sense or the predictions that we have from some theory. Right? Something that just doesn't make sense. And there's this guy, Diego Gambetta, he was one of my advisors in Oxford. He's an amazing guy. He's one of those thinkers, you see him, the guy just completely changed your world, because he lets you flip things around, look at things from a different angle. And then afterwards you're completely mind-boggled after talking with him. So he says, the best ones are those which seem outlandish at first, but once studied closely, they put our theories to a test and then reveal something of unexpected importance. Right? Okay, so we have our experiences, our common sense, we walk through the world, we observe things around us, and that's absolutely fine. Or you might read something, you do the readings, and then you look at the picture and something is very odd. Something is off. Where you wonder, how can that be? Right? Where you had an understanding, where you thought you had an understanding about how the world works, but then you look at one other case, one other scenario, and there it just doesn't make sense. Or from a theoretical point of view, you have a theory that would clearly suggest something, but in the real world, it's not what you find at all. So that's sort of a puzzle, right? Puzzle can be theoretical in nature, something that the literature just doesn't make sense of, or something empirical where some observation just don't make sense with the understanding that we have. While puzzles can be of different natures, some of them are very important, very real. Other ones seem funny at first, but they might help us to reveal things about our world, our social world, that we had not thought about before, right? So let me give you some examples for puzzles, for interesting puzzles. Okay, why do women commit suicide more often than men only in China? Yeah. Everywhere else in the world, it's the other way around. Men commit more suicide than women. Everywhere else in the world, there are reasons for that, or there are explanations. We think what are the explanations for that. But somehow these explanations just don't work in China. That just defies everything else that we know about the phenomena, is completely flipped around. Why is that the case? Another very interesting puzzle is, why are there so many Islamic terrorists with degrees in engineering and so few with degrees in Islamic studies? Half of them are engineers. Then you could wonder, maybe it is about blowing up stuff, yeah? And maybe engineers just tend to know how to blow things up, and maybe terrorist groups have a demand for guys who know how to blow things up. But when you look closer at that, and that's actually what this guy Diego Gambetta did, he just wrote a book about it called The Engineers of Jihad, fascinating read, where he even shows, in the case of the Hamas, that the engineers, they're not the guys blowing up stuff. The engineers are often the administrators, they are sort of the bureaucrats, they are sort of doing very different jobs. Jobs that you would not have thought or not have expected based on the explanations that you had before. And then he finds even some other startling findings, that when you are an engineer in Turkey, you're more likely to become a terrorist than when you're an engineer in Saudi Arabia. It's also something that you would not have guessed. Another interesting puzzle is, why do average IQ scores increase by 3 points every 10 years? Well, this is great news to you guys. You are objectively more intelligent than your grandparents. There's hard proof for that. You can show it. Basically, we have this IQ test, people's intelligence is being measured. And when you look at how people do that, every once in a while, every 20 years, they have to revise these tests because people would score so high. So every 10 years, people would go up on average sort of by 3 points. And this leads to these things, if you would, for example, if you guys would take a test that was an IQ test from 100 years ago, with that sort of rating that they had at the time, and if you would take that test, on average, you would score around 130. That's really intelligent. That's really high. So you guys, you could all be professors, you could all have a great life, all great jobs and whatnot. So you would score really, really high on this test. And now I'm not talking about just that maybe nowadays you learn different things in school, or maybe you your education works differently. No, let's take all of these things away and just look at the things, that objectively a person 100 years ago could have known, and something that you can know right now, you would score much higher. Or the other way around, if we would take somebody from 100 years ago and have them take the test from today, they would on average score 70 points. That's sort of at the border of what we nowadays call intellectual disability. So that's sort of a huge difference if you think about it. And then you could say, okay, maybe this is all because of evolution. Maybe intelligent people strive, they know how to multiply. That's sort of an evolutionary argument, which is, by the way, not true, which is actually another puzzle, that they multiply less. But let's assume that evolution is just not fast enough to catch up with that. So the development or the increase in IQ scores is just so rapid that evolution couldn't account for it. So that's a puzzle. That's a puzzle. In psychology, actually, this is called the Flynn effect. People have all sorts of explanations for it. Another puzzle: why does India never win medals at the Olympics? They have 1.2 billion people. At the last Olympics in Rio, 2014, they won 0 medals. Not a single medal. When we take the whole history of modern Olympic Games, India won a total of 37 medals with 9 gold medals. When we look at Ireland, right? Ireland has 4.5 million people. Ireland, in the same period, maybe the first 20 years there was no Ireland. We can debate about that. But since in the modern Olympic Games, Ireland won a total of 53 medals. So India has 300 times as many people as Ireland, but Ireland wins more medals in the Olympics. So that's a puzzle. Right? So these are all sort of things where we observe something in the world and they sort of startle us. They sort of make us wonder, how can that be? Right? It sort of defies our expectations, or it goes against our common sense or our theoretical ideas. Another puzzle, believe it or not, the highest rate of plastic surgeries is in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Why is that the case? Another puzzle that John Elster discovered. He's this guy that I admire. He's this Norwegian guy. He's now a professor at Columbia University, and he made this observation that the books that are most stolen from Oxford libraries are theology books. Again, that's something that you would not necessarily expect, right? I thought those guys shouldn't steal. After all, they're being told, right? That's a puzzle. So how do we know about these puzzles? Well, it's through our experiences, our everyday life. We read about them. You read a newspaper article, or you hear about it somewhere. Why? Or maybe you read an academic paper or a book. You come to the lectures, you listen to these things, you learn great things here. I tell you all these things about life and puzzles in India. Or you just open your eyes. And in some ways, this is what sociology for me is all about. You need to open your eyes. You just need to look around you. You need to look at the people. You need at the society that is constantly around you. It's different for sociology than compared to other disciplines. For us, society is constantly around us. It's always around us, right? So you need to open your eyes. You need to look at the things. So now we have this puzzle. We have these questions. Why does India never win any medals? Why are there so many engineers in terrorist groups? These are sort of the puzzles, right? That kind of keep us busy. And then the first thing we want to know, or the first thing we need to do, is ask ourselves, is it really a puzzle? We need to establish that, right? So a puzzle, this is sort of this common folk knowledge. I picked up something in the newspaper somewhere about India, or I saw a documentary about suicide, and somebody mentioned there's something about China, this being the other way around, and so on. This is how it starts, right? So we kind of are curious about the world, we kind of learn something, and then we need to go, and then we need to systematically look at, is this really a puzzle? So we need to establish the facts. Make sure that it actually is a puzzle, or maybe it is just something about how we calculated stuff. So coming back to the first question that I had here, which country has the highest crime rate? Actually, the answer is it's the Vatican. The Vatican has the highest crime rate of all of these countries. I think, how can that be? Now that's a puzzle. Am I suggesting that all of those guys are crooked? Right? Maybe some of them are. Maybe some of them are not, but let's establish the facts. Is this really a puzzle? Well, first of all, we can go and collect we can look at the statistics, that's sort of what I did before. We can look at the statistics, what is the crime rate in these different countries? And then we actually do see, indeed, Vatican has a very high crime rate. Actually, it's extraordinarily high. Then we need to go further. Is this really a puzzle, or is this something about how maybe we calculate the crime rate? And here we are. So this is sort of a very easy way. It's a puzzle that I can dismantle very quickly. It's not really a puzzle when we think about it. It is because of the way crime rate is being calculated. Right? Crime rate is calculated as the number of criminal offenses, right, that occur in a country, divided by the number of people that live in that country. Well, in the Vatican, there are only 455 people living there. right? So the population is very small. At the same time, you know, we have a lot of offenses. We have tourists coming in. Most of the time it's pickpocketing or shoplifting. You know, maybe it's not even that much anyway to begin with. You know, there are maybe 400 of civil offenses or 600 penal offenses. When you compare that with Ireland, that's nothing. Yeah, that's what happens in Ireland in a day. But Ireland has a much larger population to begin with, right? Crime rate is calculated as crime per population. That's how it goes. And then for the Vatican, you know, this would give us a crime rate. There are more crimes than people living in the Vatican. So it's a crime rate of 133% for the penal offences. When you compare that with Ireland, the same crime rate would be 5.3. So that's sort of a puzzle, right? That was a startling finding to begin with. I asked you which country has the highest crime rate. You said Mexico, yeah, that makes all a lot of sense. Then I say, no, it's the Vatican. That's the puzzle. How can that be? And then we need to start, and then we need to be systematic in taking these things apart. So we need to be very clear what we are looking at. Okay, so that's about puzzles, right? And often in analytical sociology, we start with puzzles. Well, I think starting with puzzles is very interesting anyway, right? So a lot of research is boring. I think puzzles are not boring. Now that's kind of the stuff, because we are puzzled by it, we are actually also interested in, right? Okay, so that's puzzles. Let me move on to the second thing, to explanations. So we already talked about that the last time. You know, we brought it up. You know, I mentioned this deductive nomological model, and you know how we explain things, and I introduced that in analytical sociology, it's all about explaining stuff, right? We want to know how not only how things are related with each other, but we also want to know how they come about, right? So this was this idea of the mechanism, which is sort of this plausible story in between, which is sort of this configuration of actors, you know, and their interdependencies with each other that regularly bring about the phenomena that we observe, right? So that's sort of what how we go about explaining things. That's sort of the general structure of an explanation. On the one side, we have what we call the explanans. You know, that's what explains it, and on the other side, we have the explanandum. That's what we want to explain. So that could be our puzzle, right? The puzzle is on the one side, it's on the right side, and our explanation is on the other side. Okay, but what do we do when we have now, and often, almost always when you do research, this is what you're going to find. You will have different mechanisms that can explain the same thing. You have different stories how something could have come about. So then the key is how do we distinguish these things? Yeah? How do we take them apart from each other? And that's sort of the hard work where as a researcher you need to be very persistent and dig deep to distinguish different explanations, different possible explanations from each other, right? So to get as close as possible to what you think is happening. While we can never know that this is sort of the thing for sure, you know, I talked about this in my first year lecture. I hope that you guys pick this up at some point as well. We can never, when being researchers, when being scientific about what we do, we can never verify something. The only thing we can do is show if something is wrong. Now that's sort of this idea of falsifiability. Karl Popper introduced that. You know, when you have, let's say I say all swans are white. Now that's sort of the classic example. All swans in the world are white. I cannot really verify that, but I can show when it is wrong with absolute certainty. I just need to find one swan that is black. Then I've disproved this statement with absolute certainty. While when I say all swans are white, I cannot say that for sure. Maybe I just didn't look at enough swans. Maybe there's one down there in Australia. I don't know if they have swans, but maybe there is one down there that I just haven't found, or the guy was hiding when I traveled around the world to find all the swans and looked at whether they are white or black. Right? So that's sort of this idea. That's the problem of induction. That's induction, having data and deducing general claims from that. That's sort of the opposite of deduction, where we have general claims, we deduce something else from it that follows naturally from it. Induction is sort of we have data, we observe something in the world, and we come up with a general principle that is sort of induced, that moves up from the observations that we have, right? And when we do that, which is a reasonable strategy, that sort of stuff that I don't know, Francis Bacon, David Hume came up, these sort of big philosophers, a few hundred years ago, and there's a lot to talk about stuff, but that's for another lecture. And but those guys, said we need to go out, we need to get data, and we need to show if we can find with data what we postulate theoretically. Right? But there the problem is that we can never show if something is true. We can only show if something is wrong. So actually, when you conduct a study, actually this is how you need to design your study as well. You shouldn't design your study in a way so that you want to prove that something is right. You need to conduct your study and design it in such a way so that it could prove that the theory could potentially be wrong. That's sort of how you acquire scientific knowledge. That's sort of the process of knowledge acquisition. So anyway, so now we have these different plausible explanations for something. How do we go about distinguishing them from each other? Well, I already mentioned there's this guy, Jon Elster. He's this Norwegian guy. He's somebody where I get the jitters when he comes into the room, because he's just a very intelligent guy. He just has all these honorary doctorates and whatnot. He's now at Columbia University, and he, in his book Explaining Social Behavior, which is a very interesting read, if you're interested in these kind of things, about how we make explanations, and being rigorous and precise about that, he sort of gives us a strategy for that. He gives us a strategy. He calls this the hypothetical deductible method. I don't know, don't ask me. It's a strategy for how we can go about answering our puzzles. How can we systematically approach the puzzles that we have? So he says, choose a theory that holds out the greatest promise, for successful explanation. Specify a hypothesis that applies the theory to the puzzle, in the sense that sort of the explanandum, what we want to explain, logically follows from the hypothesis. Next step, identify or imagine plausible accounts that might provide alternative explanations. So these are these other stories, right? So you have one idea about how something comes about. When you have that, it's great, but that's just a starting point. That's just a starting point. When you have an idea, you want to explain something. You have an idea how you can explain something. Then, from that point, you need to start thinking about, okay, what else could explain it? And you need to come up with different plausible explanations. And that's sort of what I'm teaching my first years, that when I give you a phenomena and I ask you for how it comes about, you need to be immediately able to come up with 3 different plausible explanations. That's sort of what social research is about. Thinking about alternative explanations, and then sort of we move on, what Elsa here says, for each one of these rival accounts, that's sort of the fourth point, refute them. Refute them by pointing to additional testable implications that are in fact not observed. Right? So he says we have now this one explanation that we think that holds the most promise, but now let's think of other plausible explanations and then show that these other ones are wrong. Go and find some evidence or think about ways how you could show that if those other things are true, or if they would be wrong, then you wouldn't observe, or you would observe something else. So these are sort of these other facts that you might observe or not observe that are implications from your alternative explanations. And then the last point, he says, so we have these plausible alternatives, we try to knock them out, right, one after the other. And that's sort of the systematic way of going about stuff. Knock these things out. And the better, the more solid the stuff that you knock out is, the better your contribution is. Right? Everybody can knock out a straw man, but when you take the heavyweight and you kind of knock out the heavyweight champion in the field, then you really showed something. The fifth point then is to go back to the original hypothesis, to the original explanation that we have, and look at what he calls excess explanatory power. So that means if that is true, if our hypothesis is true, it would also mean something else. Right? There's an implication that comes directly from our hypothesis. And that something else we can go and study. And then when we show that not only our hypothesis seems to be true, that's sort of the minimal requirement of an explanation, what Elster says, but also the other stuff, like these implications that follow from the excess explanatory power of our explanation, then we can be even more confident in our original hypothesis and explanation. Okay, let me walk you through that. So Jon Elster, he's sort of this mellow guy, he likes to go to musicals. Yeah, he's a cultural interested person in New York. It's great, so much stuff to do. The guy lived there for a while. He goes to Broadway shows, and he made this observation that Broadway shows seem to receive more standing ovations today than 20 years ago. So that's a puzzle to begin with. That's a puzzle that's an observation that Jon Elster makes. Right? There's no real scientific research about that, right? So that's just an observation that he made from going to Broadway shows over his life, right? Then he sees, God, people are standing up all the time. They didn't used to do that. Right? So that's sort of the puzzle that we have. So the first thing would be to establish this phenomenon, establish the facts, right? It's difficult in this case, but maybe you can get hold of some old video recordings or whatnot, right, in a systematic way, so that you could establish the fact, is it really true that people stand up more often in Broadway shows today than they used to do 20 years ago? So that's sort of the first point. Okay, and then how do we, let's now assume that we have our explanation. So let's assume we have the facts established, people stand up more often than they used to. How can we explain this now? Well, the first point that Elster mentions here is choose a theory that holds out the greatest promise of successful explanation. So this is where we are creative. Yeah? This is sort of where we think, right? Or this is where the literature comes into play. This is sort of where we think about what is a possible explanation. A theory is essentially something that helps you to answer your question. That's what it is. Right? A theory is sort of a general thing that when you apply it to your problem, it answers your problem. So Elster has this idea, maybe it has to do with increased ticket prices. So maybe over the last 20 years, Broadway shows just got more expensive. Yeah? It's another observation that he makes. He's there, he's been there for a while. He sees prices gradually increase. How could that matter for the number of people standing in Broadway shows? Well, now the theory that Elster has is that when people spend a lot of money for something, they feel bad about it, right? And then they feel more obliged to think that it actually was a good show. You spend a lot of money on something. Sure, we all have these things. You purchase something very expensive, and you go home, and then you think, should I have really spent that much money on it? You wait a few days, and then you convince yourself that it was a good purchase. Right? So that's sort of this idea that when people spend a lot of money for it, that then they change their worldview and tell themselves that it was actually a good thing. So applied to the standing ovations, what does it mean? Well, people spend a lot of money for Broadway shows, right? And then they tell themselves after they watch the show that it actually was a good show, even though it might not have been a good show. So that's a theory, and we come back to that in a while as well. Actually, it's a very established theory. It's called theory of cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger came up with that, and it's a very widely tested theory. But Elster sort of first comes up with his version of that it's about paying money for something and then feeling more happy about it because you spend so much money on it. Okay, so the next step that he outlines here is that we should go and specify a hypothesis that applies the theory to the puzzle that we have, in the sense that the explanandum follows logically from the hypothesis. Okay, so our explanandum here is more standing ovations. Right? This is sort of the thing that we want to explain, and we explain it. So on the other side, our explanans, so that's what Elsa suggests, it's increased ticket prices. Yeah? So we have this relationship, and we even have a mechanism in between. You know, there's sort of this story that I just outlined, right? So that kind of people feel bad, whatnot, and then kind of they change the way they think about the show. Okay, so that's sort of a hypothesis that we now have. Now Elsa says, okay, now identify or imagine plausible accounts that might provide alternative explanations. So that's always how it goes, right? So when you do research, never just have your own idea and think that's it, but that's the starting point to think as hard and as bad as you can to come up with alternative accounts of the whole thing. Alternative explanations, and then you try to knock them out. In a way that, he says here that, first of all, you have different alternative explanations. So one alternative explanation that John Elster has is, 20 years pass by, and he also looks around the people that go to Broadway shows, and then he thinks maybe it's about a different audience. Maybe in the last 20 years the audience just different. So he says now there are more and more people from New Jersey coming to New York for Broadway shows for whatever reason. Maybe they can travel more or whatnot, right? And those people are just very easy to impress. So it's a change in the audience. And because of that, they stand up at the end of the day. Because they just don't know better, right? So here now, the alternative explanation is that the audience is easier to impress. The audience changed, and that leads to more standing observations. And that's a perfectly reasonable alternative, right? It makes a lot of sense. And then, as I said, when you encounter a puzzle or a social problem, you need to think about the alternatives. That's sort of where you need to train your brain for. Think about alternative explanations that could be equally true. Another alternative explanation that Jon Elster comes up with. Well, he says, maybe the Broadway shows just got better. For whatever reason. People just learn from their mistakes. Today, Broadway shows are just better than the shows 20 years ago. That is why more people stand up at the end of the shows. So now we have an alternative explanation here. Shows got better. That leads to more standing ovations. Again, we can think of a mechanism in between. I'm leaving that out here. Okay, so now we have our main hypothesis. We have different alternatives that could equally be true. Now, as it says, for each of these rival accounts, we should refute them by pointing to additional testable implications that are, in fact, not observed. I remember we can never show something is true, but we can be absolutely certain when something is not true. Okay, now there's what Elster calls lateral support, or support from the side. So let's start with the idea of, it's all about the Jersey people, and that they are not the cleverest, and they're easy to get impressed. Don't ask me why I know these things here. And this would be our alternative explanation. Right? Okay. So now let's think about what if that would be true. If that would be true, that it's all about changes in the audience, well, then we would also observe more standing observations when we actually have performances where these different audiences live. So when we have Broadway shows that have out-of-town performances, they travel around the country and they are sort of in a rural area. If it's all about the people living in rural areas or living outside of New York, they're not as blasé, and spoiled like the New York arrogant citizens, right? If it's all about that, then you would observe more standing ovations also elsewhere, right? When the performance is not in New York, but in New Jersey. Something else that would follow from that, if it is about people coming to New York, right, then you would actually now imagine that there are sort of some days where there's a winter storm or whatnot, traffic is just completely broken down, except on the island of Manhattan, and still working out, you still get around there. If it is about people, other sorts of people going to the Broadway shows, then you would observe fewer standing ovations when for whatever reason those guys cannot come. Right? These are things that we now can go out and test. And if we now can show that neither the one, that there are more standing ovations for out-of-town performances, or that kind of there are not fewer standing ovations when the weather completely breaks down, right? There are as many standing ovations as the other days, right? Based on that, we could then deduce that the alternative explanation is not true. So that's sort of how we could knock that out, right? Okay, let's think about the second alternative explanation that we had. That Broadway shows just got better. Right, so here we are. This is sort of our alternative explanation. Well, if that is true, that Broadway shows just got better, and that the standing ovations is a consequence of that, well, you would observe that Broadway shows also got better reviews. So that if you look at, this is data that you could collect, right? You could collect reviews of Broadway shows over the last 20 years, and you code them somehow, and you look at how favorably reviewed were they, right? And then, if you don't find that, that the reviews constantly got better, this sort of makes us wonder whether the alternative explanation is true. Right? So again, this is sort of an attempt to knock these things out. The last one that Elsa here has is strengthen the original hypothesis by showing that it has additional testable implications. And this is what he calls support from below. So imagine now, this is sort of his main hypothesis, higher ticket prices lead to more standing ovations. Now he says, if that is true, we should also observe that for Broadway shows, where for whatever reason there was no increase in ticket prices, that there should be fewer standing ovations. Another thing, if it is true, if it is all about the ticket prices and people feeling bad about that, and then telling themselves that it was a good show, you would also observe that for Broadway shows, where let's say companies give out free tickets, they are expensive tickets, but companies give them out for free to their employees, you would also observe fewer standing ovations. So you see how we kind of try to take these things apart and thinking about different alternatives and thinking about what these different alternatives would mean, and then trying to knock out these alternative claims. Elsa also says we can support an explanation from above. By that he means, okay, we have here now our relationship, and support from above means that we actually have a well-established theory, something else, that we have been shown in general, that kind of gives us support for that. And for this relationship, I mentioned we have the theory of cognitive dissonance. It's a very general theory, which is widely tested and widely supported by this guy, Leon Festinger. And the theory of cognitive dissonance basically says that you have internal dissonance among beliefs or values. Right? Let's say you spend a lot of money for something, but you feel bad about it. Right? Or you smoke cigarettes, but you know that it's unhealthy. Right? So that's sort of these internal conflicts that you have. And then people don't want to live with these internal conflicts. That's basically his idea. And then there's a mental adjustment process happening where then we need to tell ourselves smoking is not that bad, many other people do it, or we say, oh, the show was great, to reduce this cognitive dissonance. That's sort of this idea of the theory of cognitive dissonance. And this is a theory, it's very general, and it has been tested in many different settings. I mentioned the example of the smoking, and that's actually true. People smoke, and they know that smoking is bad, so what they start doing, they start telling themselves lots of other people smoke, and then they start at some point believing that smoking is actually not that bad. Or something that you also find is that, and there are beautiful tests that you can do where you can look at, okay, how strong is this dissonance that people have, right? Because the more it is, the more you would think that people have this mental adjustment process happening. So when people who believe that lying is wrong, when they are forced to lie, at some point they start believing in their lie. Because they cannot change being forced, right? So that's sort of somebody forces them. So the only thing they can change is the other thing to resolve this internal conflict, this cognitive dissonance. Okay, so that's sort of going about explanations. Let me introduce the fallacies, and we'll talk more about that on Thursday then as well. But let me get started with that. So fallacies means, and that was what this reading today was about, that we need to be very careful when we look, so we want to explain stuff, right? And now I'm introducing the fallacies because when we explain stuff, we need to be very careful about what we explain and how we explain it. Because when we have a population, for example, that's sort of what we call the ecological fallacy. When we have a population and when we know something about a population, we cannot necessarily draw conclusions from that about the individuals that are in that population. And that's very, very important. That's very important for you to remember as you go in your sociology degree, that from populations you cannot deduce on individuals, right? And actually then you have these very funky things, and we'll talk about it on Thursday. You know that in the US the primaries are coming up, elections, and what you do find is that in rich states in the US, people vote more for the Democrats. But when you look at individuals, the richer people vote for the Republicans. So how can that be? So sometimes it's just really flipped the other way around, and that's sort of what we call the ecological fallacy, that based on what we know from a population of people, we cannot draw conclusions for the individuals that form that population. And here is now the reading, and we had the result. Did I have that here? Anyway, no, I didn't. Anyway, so we had this thing about the study in Berkeley, right? Where we had at the university level, it seemed that men got more accepted to Berkeley than women. 44% of men seemed to get accepted, while only 35% of the women got accepted. At the departmental level, however, it was the other way around. And there you see, when somebody asks you about, is there discrimination in the world, should we do something about it, you really need to know about this stuff. You really need to know about these different levels here, because based on the first point that we have here, you would conclude, well, we should do something, we should help women, right? Because they are being discriminated against. But when you look closer at the data, it's actually the other way around. So then the explanation in a nutshell really was that, as I mentioned already, that there are different departments with different acceptance rates, and there's a big difference in where male and female applicants want to go to. So, for example, in the English department, the applicants, 65% of them were female, but it was also a very hard department to get in with, right? So there's a low acceptance rate. While for the mechanical engineering department at Berkeley, most of the applicants were male, but it was a much easier department to get in, right? So these different levels that we will talk more about next week. However, as a last point, remember this ecological fallacy. We'll come back to that next week. I think it also works the other way around. So by knowing something about individuals, we cannot necessarily draw conclusions about the population. And that is actually really challenging, right? Because often we see individuals, or we only see the population level, and we need to be aware of these different layers. So that's what I call the analytical fallacy, that based on what we know from individuals alone, we cannot draw conclusions about a population either. And that's something that this course tries to tackle. Anyway, so until Thursday, the next reading is going to be from Thomas Schelling. Remember, there are some formulas, equations in there. Don't freak out about that. Just read through it. Schelling is actually very good in describing the things in words as well, that you can all understand. And see you on Thursday in the end theater. Thanks very much.